and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Police Quest: In Pursuit of the Death Angel, a third-person adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for a variety of computer platforms including MS-DOS, Amiga, Atari ST, and the Apple II back in 1987, with an eventual point-and-click remake following in 1992. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front, with the most important order of business being the fact that this is not a normal episode. This is one of our Patreon-sponsored episodes. This episode is sponsored by Wendell Jr., otherwise known as Film Kid, over on Discord. Wendell recorded a message for all of us to listen to about why Police Quest was his choice for his next sponsored episode. So Wendell, take it away.
Hello everyone, Film Kid here again, or as a number of you know me as, the Square Enix guy. Well, before Square and Enix got together, or even before I knew what a Final Fantasy was, there was a holy trinity of games that made me fall in love with the world of gaming. It was the early 90s and my dad just got a Tandy 1000 to do bookkeeping for the cleaning business he started up. And in addition, he got some games for it as well. Among those games were the arcade classic Outrun, a helicopter combat sim titled LHX Attack Chopper, and the Sierra classic we are discussing here today, and my introduction to storytelling and gaming. This game gave us one of Sierra's greatest protagonists. That's right, folks. We're talking about Larry Laffer. I'm totally joking, guys. I didn't play Leisure Suit Larry until a couple years later, but that's a story for another day. No, I'm actually talking about Officer Sonny Bond, and the game we're talking about is Police Quest. This game, and in fact the entire series, is absolutely a core memory for me, and was responsible for me being a police officer / detective for like a 3-year stretch of Halloweens. Like Tony, I was very interested in learning the different police codes, as well as the procedural aspects of conducting traffic stops, detaining suspects, and patrol vehicle inspections. But it is Sonny and his story arc through the first 3 iterations of the Police Quest series, going from beat cop to detective, that has kept me coming back, playing each game several times through the decades. For some kids, their hero was Superman or Ken Griffey Jr. For me, it was Sonny Bond. I look forward to hearing Tony's thoughts on this replay. Until next time, Film Kid is 1010, over and out.
Thank you, Wendell, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean, Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Police Quest: In Pursuit of the Death Angel. Police Quest: In Pursuit of the Death Angel is a third-person adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for a variety of computer platforms back in 1987, with an eventual point-and-click remake following in 1992. Before we can talk about Police Quest, we need to take a step back and talk about the creation of the company behind the game, Sierra Online. Because, as many are aware, Sierra was one of the preeminent adventure game studios of the 80s and 90s, and throughout their history, they brought a number of different games and franchises to life, including such classics as King's Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Space Quest, Gabriel Knight, and, of course, the game of the day, Police Quest. Before there was Police Quest, though, and even before there was a Sierra Online, there was Online Systems, a small company founded by two early computer industry pioneers, the husband-wife duo of Ken and Roberta Williams. Interestingly, Ken and Roberta Williams never intended to get involved in the early computer game industry, and Roberta, in particular, had absolutely no interest in computers at all. Ken, by contrast, was always a bit of an entrepreneur, and he saw the value in pursuing various opportunities in the computer industry, including the potential of porting popular business software packages to different computer platforms, a type of business venture that sounds pretty boring today, but back in late 70s and early 80s was actually pretty big business. This potentially lucrative opportunity is what drove Ken to purchase his first Apple II computer in 1980, as he was interested in creating a port of the fairly popular Fortran programming language over to the Apple II, which he thought would be able to challenge BASIC as the standard programming tool for Apple computers. For those who may need a refresher, BASIC is an acronym for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, and was a simple, higher-level programming language that was used pretty widely across the majority of the Apple computer ecosystem of the time, without much competition from other programming languages at the time. Ken Williams wanted to change all of that by bringing Fortran to Apple computers, and to understand why that proposed project was a big deal, we need to talk just a little bit about how computer programming languages were distributed in the early days of the personal computer market. For those who may be unaware, around this time, computer programming languages were not nearly as pervasive as what we see in today's market, and beyond that, the simple act of running software on different computer platforms required extensive work. Think about today, where you might have a software development environment like Unity that talented developers can use to generate executable code that can be packaged to run on any number of target systems, like home consoles, computers, and even portable devices like tablets and phones. Modern tools make that kind of thing easy, and oftentimes the creators of those tools offer versions of the toolset that run on any number of common computer platforms, like Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. Back in the late 70s, though, the concept of multiple versions of anything being provided by a single software creator was a rarity, and oftentimes making software work on platforms that weren't targeted by those companies required someone else to actually port the software or tool to those different platforms, which was a surprisingly lucrative business to be in, assuming your ports were higher quality than most amateur efforts of the time. Ken Williams had always considered himself to be a talented software developer, and he believed he had the skill needed to complete his Fortran port and hopefully make some money doing it. So he decided to make things official, creating a company of his own to perform this future work under. That company would be called Online Systems. Despite Ken's focus on business software, during one of his work assignments, he acquired access to a brand new game that had been making the rounds across numerous computer mainframe, universities, and even personal computers of the time. The literal grandfather of all adventure games, Will Crowther's classic Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure, depending on which version of the game you're talking about. Ken had no interest in the game, but he figured it might be something of interest to show his wife, and might help her pass some time while she stayed at home as Ken worked on his various projects. So he introduced the game to Roberta, and she immediately became enthralled, shirking all responsibilities to play the game through to completion, even staying up overnight to try to conquer the game's various puzzles and traps. Eventually, she did beat the game, and with her newfound love of what was then considered the adventure game genre, she began to seek out other similar titles to enjoy. She tried several, enjoying the expansive for-the-time worlds that the games presented, along with their tricky and devious puzzles that required significant thought and logical leaps to solve. And after playing a bunch of these titles and drawing on prior time spent reading Agatha Christie novels and playing the classic board game Clue, Roberta became inspired. What if she could design and create her own adventure game, potentially to sell on the still nascent computer game market? The concept intrigued her, and she began discussing the idea with her husband. While he was very supportive of Roberta's ideas, Ken didn't want to create something that was derivative or similar to any of the titles that were already out there. Instead, he wanted to push the technological boundaries of what people thought were possible, and wanted to create something that would be different from the status quo, which around this time was a predominantly text-driven, non-graphical user interface. Ever the visionary, Ken decided that Roberta's game proposal needed to exceed the expectations of the market, so he fired back a proposal of his own. He would help Roberta create her game, but it would have to transcend a purely text interface. He wanted to create a title with full-featured graphics. To put things into perspective, at this time in computer gaming, the concept of graphics on a computer screen wasn't really much of a thing, and the majority of computer systems available didn't even have any discrete mechanisms for generating graphics at all. Looking specifically at the adventure games that had been released up to this point, whose interfaces were purely text-driven, there wasn't even a passing thought that graphics could improve the experience of what had, up to that point, been more akin to interactive novels as opposed to a more visual kind of experience. That was all about to change, though, as Roberta Williams set out to create her first game, Mystery House. The story behind the development of Mystery House is actually really interesting and shows a great deal of ingenuity, and we spoke at length about the creation of that game during our episode on King's Quest. We're not going to revisit all of that history here, except to say that Roberta and Ken Williams succeeded in exploiting the unique quirks of the Apple II computer system to create an adventure game that for the first time would utilize a graphical display coupled with a text parser interface to provide players with an experience they had literally never seen before. Mystery House would prove to be a hit amongst players following its release in 1980, and its success would spur Roberta and Ken Williams on to create more games in what would eventually become their high-res adventure series, with Roberta Williams' second game veering away from mystery and instead focusing on traditional medieval fantasy, which is what formed the foundation of the title known as The Wizard and the Princess, which would end up releasing around 4 months following Mystery House in the summer of 1980. Before beginning work on that new game, the Williams duo decided that they were going to take the concept of Mystery House's graphics and expand upon them. To put that into perspective, by default, the Apple II, which is the system that they were primarily designing for, could display 6 colors as part of its high-resolution mode. And yes, I said high resolution. Obviously, looking back at that number now, it's laughable that 6 colors was ever considered a high-resolution kind of image, but that was simply the state of computer graphics in the early 80s, and it was a core constraint that everyone had to work within. Mystery House was designed with that constraint in mind, and as a result, it looked fairly simple, with various colors displaying on screen only as a result of some pretty darn esoteric Apple II graphics rules that Steve Wozniak had programmed into the computer that basically made different types of lines display using different colors. And when I say esoteric graphics rules, I really mean it. As an example, depending on the number of pixels wide a vertical line was, the color of that line would change, which feels really arbitrary to me. And I'm not saying that those rules make a ton of sense, but for a dedicated programmer, exploiting the rules behind drawing Apple II graphics could potentially lead to some fairly impressive results. You just needed to know all of those rules and have a creative vision for how to use them. The thing is though, at the time, nobody was really exploring the graphics capabilities of the system, except for, of course, Ken Williams. As always, Ken wanted to create a wow factor with any game he or his company, Online Systems, would create. To do that, though, within the confines of 6 colors, would prove to be difficult for anyone. So, in another act of ingenuity and creativity, Ken went about creating new color-based graphics drawing programs on the Apple II that could effectively increase the perceived colors on the computer from 6 to 21. This process, which was accomplished using a technique called dithering, involved placing specific, differently colored pixels near each other, which would then be blended together as a result of the unique circuitry inside of every Apple II computer, creating the human perception that more colors were being painted on the screen than what were actually being used inside the computer program. The software Ken created for this process was so advanced, in fact, that Online Systems ended up selling those graphics programs as standalone software packages for others to buy and use. And if you ever have a chance, I highly recommend you take a look at the pictures that these graphics programs were capable of, or perhaps simply compare the graphics from Mystery House with the graphics from The Wizard and the Princess. The difference in quality, from my perspective, is dramatic. Anyway, The Wizard and the Princess was designed very similarly to Mystery House, albeit with much more advanced graphics like we just talked about. It still had a text parser for inputs and a graphical display for depicting pseudo-interactive scenes, but the game was a fair bit more complex than the quaint stylings of Mystery House, with many more puzzles to solve and more scenes to explore. The story, unlike Mystery House's focus on an Agatha Christie-esque murder mystery style game, which you might have also guessed by the game's title, was focused more on a fantasy-like setting, which observant listeners will likely surmise would eventually lead to the fairy tale concepts that would be used to great effect in King's Quest, arguably one of the most well-known and influential adventure titles of all time. The story behind the creation of King's Quest, like I mentioned, was discussed in depth during our episode on King's Quest from several months ago. So if you want to learn more about that game's creation, I encourage you to check out that episode. Anyway, following the success of King's Quest, Sierra Online, which was the new name of Online Systems, would become an incredibly popular development studio known for their adventure game releases. And here, Ken Williams had a business model that he believed was legitimately the best in the industry. Ken recognized that many developers or game designers he might hire were effectively the best talent in the industry, namely because he only wanted to work with and hire the best and brightest individuals to work with his studio. And because he would only hire the best and brightest talent, he trusted those individuals to create worthwhile games without a significant amount of leadership oversight. His thought was, the designers he hired were all hired for a specific reason, whether that was due to their comedic brilliance, their unique perspectives on science fiction, or their love of medieval fantasy environments and settings, and he trusted each designer on his staff to create the games they wanted to create in the style that best matched their own unique skill sets. So, when someone like aspiring comedian and musician Al Lowe was hired into the company, Ken Williams didn't bat an eye when it was suggested that a lesser-known text-based adventure title like Soft Porn Adventure could potentially be converted into a lewd adult comedy graphical adventure game. Williams trusted that Lowe would be able to do what he proposed, which is why Leisure Suit Larry was greenlit without any sort of leadership pushback. The caveat, though, was that Ken Williams expected quality and sales for any titles his developers would work on. As long as your game sold, Williams was happy, and you'd be free to pretty much work on whatever you wanted to work on. If your games didn't sell, though, then Williams would have no issue showing you the door. He expected greatness, and that's exactly what the early Sierra Online game developers delivered with each and every game they worked on. The good news for Sierra and their development staff was that gamers across the world really enjoyed Sierra's unique and, for the time, advanced take on the adventure game formula, with a fairly traditional text parser interface married with on-screen graphics and a fully controllable player avatar, a style of adventure game that, up to this point, hadn't been replicated by many other companies in the industry. Sierra's claim to fame throughout their early history, beyond their game's technical advancements, was the fact that when you picked up a Sierra title, you were going to be whisked away to a fantasy world where outlandish situations ruled the day, or where comedic situations made you laugh out loud due to the crazy humor being flung in your general direction. Through the mid-80s, the majority of Sierra adventure titles were not serious affairs. Sure, some of them, like the aforementioned Leisure Suit Larry, may have been more mature, adult-themed titles, but serious? No, that wasn't really Sierra's focus at all. Ken Williams, however, was always interested in expanding his company's breadth of experiences, and as the later 80s approached, he began to think about the potential of creating a mature, serious adventure title that would make players tackle real-world problems directly. Rather than being restricted to a fantasy setting, Williams envisioned an in-game city inspired by real-world urban settings, where drugs and prostitution would run rampant, and players would take on the role of an up-and-coming police officer whose goal was to clean up the streets and, ultimately, put an end to a local crime lord's reign. Within the context of the game Williams envisioned, every theme and subject was fair game, and unlike other companies, Sierra wasn't afraid to create a mature, deep experience that would ostensibly be designed for adults and not children. There was just one issue. Like I mentioned earlier, Ken was a big believer in letting his designers do what they did best. If he had a comedian on staff like Al Lowe, it made sense for him to create comedic adventure titles. If he had a fantasy connoisseur on the team like Roberta Williams, then of course Ken would encourage her to continue creating medieval fantasy adventures. And if Ken wanted to create a gritty police procedural title, well, he was kinda out of luck, as nobody on his current staff had the skills, background, or expertise to create a police-centric game that would hopefully make players forget they were controlling a character on the screen, and would instead make them feel like they were, in fact, living the life of a real police officer. And what better way to drive that experience home than to have a real cop work on Ken Williams' proposed police adventure title? Unfortunately, nobody in Sierra at the time fit the bill, so Williams' mature police-themed vision had to simmer on the back burner for a bit. He remained hopeful that he'd be able to revisit the concept in the future, but for now, there was simply nothing he or the company could do to bring that idea to life. At this point, we need to go on a bit of a detour to introduce a new player in our story. Like we talked about, Sierra's rise to prominence began in 1980 with the introduction of their high-res adventure series, but in reality, the company really started to gain exposure to the broad game-playing population in 1984, which is when the very first King's Quest released to the world. While Sierra was enjoying their newfound fame, however, a separate but eventually interrelated incident would occur in the very real world that would change the trajectory of both the company and California Highway Patrolman Jim Walls forever. Walls had been a member of the California Highway Patrol since his graduation from the police academy in 1971, and over the years, Walls would end up taking on a variety of different assignments in support of the police force, seemingly content with his career. Sure, there were some very tough days, and dealing with criminals who in some cases want nothing more than to harm you and others is anything but an easy job. But for the most part, Walls handled all of those situations without issue, as his steadfast resolve that he was fighting the good fight kept him going, and gave him strength, even in the face of adversity. One day, however, in January of 1984, Walls pulled over an individual for what he believed would be a routine traffic stop, the same as he had done countless times before over his then 13-year career. Unfortunately for all involved, what Walls assumed was a routine situation that he literally faced on a daily basis would quickly escalate into an intense shootout with a recent parolee, endangering the lives of Walls and other civilians in the immediate vicinity. Following that unexpected shootout, the parolee would eventually be apprehended and sentenced to a 23-year prison sentence, in the hopes that the violent offender would be kept off the streets and behind bars, seemingly unable to injure or harm anyone else. But upon entering prison, the individual told another inmate that he was going to escape and hunt down the officer who pulled him over, who was, like we just talked about, Jim Walls. Well, it turns out that the individual Walls pulled over would, at least in part, make good on his prison yard boasts, as he did in fact escape from prison shortly after being incarcerated, and remained at large for 2 years before being caught again. Between the shootout itself and the fact that an escaped convict had declared his intention to hunt down and seek revenge on the highway patrolman that pulled him over in the first place, Jim Walls was not in a good place psychologically. And honestly, I can't blame him. I can only imagine the stress that he must have been under, being placed in a life or death situation, which he luckily survived, only to then be faced with the prospect of being hunted by a violent criminal who seemingly had nothing to lose. The fact is, Jim Walls' life would be changed forever after that incident, and around a year after that fateful traffic stop, and following a series of successive psychological issues, Walls was placed on administrative leave to evaluate his current condition, a situation that would eventually lead to him retiring from the California Highway Patrol shortly thereafter. During the same time, Ken Williams was still thinking about his idea for a gritty police-based adventure game, and how he could potentially turn his vision into a reality, though he was still coming up empty. As luck would have it though, during a routine haircut, he learned that his hairdresser's husband had previously been a police officer, and as it turns out, that hairdresser's husband was none other than Jim Walls. Ken took this as a serendipitous opportunity, and before leaving his hair appointment, he gave his stylist his business card and asked her to please have her husband call him as soon as he was able to. The thought being that perhaps Ken had finally found the individual who could help bring his police adventure title to life. Some time passed, though eventually in 1987, Walls did contact Ken Williams, and after a game of racquetball, which is about as 80s of a thing to do as watching Miami Vice reruns on television, the two sat down to begin talking about Ken's unrealized police adventure game vision. During the discussion, he asked Jim if he wouldn't mind jotting down a short, couple-page story based on some of his experiences as a cop. Thinking nothing of it, and now being in a mental state where he could revisit some of those incidents without severe traumatic stress, Walls sat down and, over a period of a few days, put together a very short, couple-page narrative about his time while working at the California Highway Patrol. Walls returned to Williams with the short narrative in hand, and upon reading the write-up, Ken asked him to expand it a little bit more, to hopefully add some additional details and flesh out some of the content. Walls went off and did just that, returning again with a now expanded narrative that Williams reviewed. And, just as before, Williams encouraged Walls to continue expanding the details of his write-up. And as Walls and Williams continued to go back and forth with this ever-expanding chronicle of real-world police incidents, Walls began to feel a renewed focus in his life. While Walls loved being a police officer, the shootout and subsequent convict escape from 1984 left him with severe emotional distress, and the trauma caused by that incident is what drove him to retire from the force following his administrative leave. Considering that trauma, Walls knew that he could never be an active duty police officer again. What he could do, though, was write about some of his past experiences, and in a way, doing so was somewhat cathartic, as he could revisit and emotionally process a lot of the stressful situations that he had ended up facing over the course of his career. With that renewed focus firmly in place, Walls and Ken Williams would continue to collaborate with each other, which eventually led to Walls joining Sierra to help create a brand new adventure game series. As it turns out, Ken Williams had found the man who could bring his police procedural vision to life, and with Walls becoming a full-time hire into Sierra Online, the adventure game series that would eventually be known as Police Quest was effectively born. Before we continue, I do have to mention that I found it interesting how Williams effectively made the process of making a game easy for Walls. Williams knew that Walls was not a game designer, nor was he developer, writer, or storyteller. But Williams knew that Walls had real-life experience, and considering what Williams was trying to accomplish with his police procedural adventure game, he knew that Walls would be the right person for the job. An interview conducted years later really hammers this point home, as Walls admitted that he didn't even know how to turn a computer on when he was asked by Williams to begin jotting down ideas for a police-based short story, and Walls would often peck out his work using just the index fingers on each hand. To say Walls was not well-versed with computers or computer games would be an understatement. But because Ken Williams knew how to get what he needed from his designers and how to help them fulfill his vision, it didn't matter. Williams believed that if you had the right kinds of creative people, the technology-related stuff would come together, and there are plenty of other stories of Williams hiring people with no programming experience to create highly successful games for Sierra. In this instance, Williams was successful in converting Jim Walls into a game designer, And the result of that effort was the eventual release of Police Quest 1 in Pursuit of the Death Angel in 1987. Now, that being said, when Walls joined the Sierra team, he was most certainly not skilled enough with computers to be a game designer. And in a move that showed just how much Williams believed in the potential of Walls' future game, he asked a number of veteran Sierra designers to assist Walls with the creation of the game. This dream team of game designers included Ken himself, King's Quest creator Roberta Williams, Space Quest luminaries Mark Crow and Scott Murphy, and Mr. Leisure Suit himself, Al Lowe. Effectively, nearly every designer that would end up creating a major Sierra franchise would assist Walls with the creation of Police Quest, though over time, Walls would become more proficient with both computers as well as the art of game design, which would lead to less handholding and more collaboration as time went on. As work continued on Police Quest, Walls knew that he wanted to truly recreate the feeling of being a cop for players to experience and hopefully enjoy. To this end, Walls would include a significant amount of real-world police procedure and flavor into the title, as well as basing in-game situations on real-world incidents he had taken part in during his 15-ish year career. Even beyond those incidents, though, Walls would also add a number of the more mundane aspects of police life as core aspects of the game. As an example, did you know that it was police policy to take a shower before changing your clothes, whether that meant putting on your police uniform or getting changed into your civilian clothes? Well, apparently that was a thing, and Walls made sure that the game included that aspect of police life in the game, multiple times throughout the game's overarching story. Similarly, though perhaps more exciting, were the real-world arrest procedures and police codes that were included in the game, the thought being that if you were going to live the life of a cop, you had to abide by real police procedures, lest you find yourself in dangerous and potentially deadly situations. As many are likely aware, Sierra titles were somewhat renowned for their ability to kill you at a moment's notice, oftentimes without any form of warning. Well, Police Quest would be designed no differently, although in this case, all of those deadly or game-ending kinds of scenarios would be caused, for the most part, by failing to follow proper police procedure. As an example, if you forgot to search a suspect at the scene of the crime, you better believe they'd most likely have a concealed weapon that they would use on you at some point, thereby ending the game and making sure you realized that, if you were going to be successful here, you needed to pay attention to the proper way to execute police processes and procedures. While some people might look at this excessive attention to detail and procedure as a detriment, or potentially a distraction from the more game-centric aspects of the title, a huge number of individuals, myself included, simply loved the feeling of being treated like a real-world cop, and I know I personally devoured the manual that came with the game, which included all sorts of cool information on how best to subdue different types of criminals, the proper way to secure and arrest a potentially dangerous suspect, police radio codes that would be used as shorthand for communicating with dispatch and other officers, various criminal violations and their corresponding police codes, and numerous other pieces of trivia that made it feel like you weren't reading an instruction manual, but were rather reading a police handbook. I'll let you all know whether such a focus on realism on procedure still holds up today in a little bit, but suffice it to say, as a child, I enjoyed every aspect of the experience. Interestingly, there has been a long-standing urban myth that Police Quest was designed with so much realism in mind that it was used as a training tool for real-world police officers. This claim originated in Sierra's self-published Interaction magazine, and while I want to believe that the game was so realistic that it helped real-world police officers do their job more efficiently, it is kinda questionable that the only spot this was mentioned was in a magazine that served as self-advertising and promotion for the game's creator. I want to believe, but I remain a bit suspicious with this one. Whether that degree of realism truly did train future police officers or not, the fact is that Police Quest was a marked departure from the majority of Sierra titles that had been released up to that point. Like we talked about, most Sierra games of the time were either fantasy-themed or designed to be more comedic in nature, and while some titles did include mature subject matter, all of that content was presented through the lens of comedy. Police Quest, by contrast, presented situations, environments, themes, and characters inspired by traumatic and mature real-world events, and in many ways, Police Quest was perhaps the most quote-unquote serious title Sierra had worked on up to that point. The only question was, would the game end up being a hit with consumers? It turns out that yes it would, as Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel would release on the market in December of 1987, at which time it would begin to garner significant critical praise, with many publications praising the game's sense of realism and maturity that had up to this point never been replicated in computer game form. Many individuals praised the game's graphics and familiar, albeit somewhat clunky, text parser interface, as Police Quest was created using Sierra's Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI engine, a tool that had evolved over time to become Sierra's core adventure game framework for nearly all of their titles. Police Quest would feature a number of enhancements over earlier AGI efforts, such as an expanded set of text synonyms to better allow players to interact with the game world, complex in-game cutscenes with multiple characters at once, a number of inventory items that could be examined, which would then lead to additional information being displayed on the screen, as well as numerous under-the-hood enhancements to improve performance on computer systems of the time. These technological advancements, coupled with the gritty adult story and situations presented in the game, would help Police Quest sell really well on the market. And while specific sales figures for the very first Police Quest title are difficult to find, the first 4 Police Quest adventures in total would sell almost 1 million copies over the course of their lifetime, cementing Police Quest as a core Sierra adventure game franchise. And speaking of that franchise, Police Quest would, over time, expand to include 12 different titles, though only the first 4 Police Quest games would be designed as adventure titles, and of those, only the first 3 would be designed by Jim Walls. Those first 3 Police Quest games have affectionately become known as the Sonny Bonds trilogy, a reference to those titles' protagonist and player character. And over the course of those 3 games, a satisfying story arc would be presented that saw Sonny grow from a low-ranking patrolman into a more experienced senior officer, with a connected and overarching narrative that tied all 3 games together into a cohesive, true trilogy of police procedural awesomeness. Over that time, a number of technological advances would also be introduced, such as Sierra's new game engine, the Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI, which made it so that games could be created without a text parser interface, and could instead be designed as true point-and-click adventures. Police Quest 3 would be the first Police Quest title released natively using the SCI, though the very first Police Quest title would eventually get the remake treatment in 1992, with a full SCI-powered release that would allow a whole new adventure game-playing audience to fully enjoy Sonny Bond's first police procedural adventure, now with updated graphics, sound, and point-and-click gameplay. Returning our attention to Jim Walls himself, as time moved on, Walls would become less enthused about continuing to create games in the Police Quest series, a level of disinterest that would cause him to become less involved in the 3rd iteration of the game, which required other game designers such as Jane Jensen of Gabriel Knight fame to jump in and finish the game. Eventually, Walls would leave Sierra entirely, deciding instead to join a relatively new computer game company founded in 1991 by former Sierra Chief Financial Officer Edmund Heinbockel. That company, Tsunami Media, would release a number of titles over the years, including Jim Walls' own Police Quest spiritual successor, Blue Force. For more information on the story behind that game, including my personal opinion on how it compared to Walls' prior Police Quest efforts, I encourage everyone to check out our episode on Blue Force from a couple years ago. Interestingly, the story doesn't quite end there, as in 2013, there was an effort by Jim Walls to create yet another spiritual successor to Police Quest. Entitled Precinct, Walls was looking to create the next generation of police procedural adventure titles, and I know I was personally excited about the prospect of a brand new Police Quest-like title with modern sensibilities and features. The effort got as far as a Kickstarter launch, but would unfortunately fail to get any traction. There were also a number of future efforts at crowdfunding, all of which were similarly unsuccessful, which left Walls with nowhere to go to make his new game. At the point of this recording, Walls is retired from the games industry, and any chance of a modern Police Quest likely rests in the hands of Microsoft, the current owner of the Sierra game catalog and intellectual property. I personally think a modern Police Quest would be awesome, and I remain hopeful that at some point in the future, that concept will be turned into reality. Regardless of what that future may hold though, the fact is that Police Quest was an important release for both Sierra, as well as within the context of the broader adventure game genre. Here was a title inspired by real-world events that presented a mature adult take on adventure gaming, and in the process, it garnered a fairly significant fan base who likely dreamt of one day putting on a police uniform and bringing criminals to justice. While I don't know how many current and future police officers were influenced by the game, what I can say is that Police Quest serves as a perfect example of Sierra's attention to detail and ever-expanding breadth of game experiences. And while it's unclear whether we'll ever get a similarly themed title in the future, the simple fact that Police Quest exists in its base form is more than enough for fans of the title. For those fans, as well as adventure gamers around the world, Police Quest will undoubtedly remain a title that they will remember fondly forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Police Quest today versus when it was released all the way back in 1987. Before we begin, I should probably mention the version of the game that I played, which was the 1987 MS-DOS original title, meaning I played the EGA graphics text parser interface version of the title. There is a point-and-click remake, like we talked about, that was released in 1992 that utilized the SCI engine, which was Sierra's next-generation adventure game technology, but for the purposes of this particular podcast episode, I did not play that one, and won't be discussing it as part of our pseudo review right now. What I will say, though, is that my very first experience with Police Quest back when I was younger was actually with the 1992 point-and-click remake. That's right, I had never played the original EGA version of the title before this episode. That's not to say that I hadn't played other similarly styled games like King's Quest and, interestingly enough, Police Quest 2, but this is the first time I played the true original Police Quest game in my whole life. What that means is that while I had a general understanding of the game's story, puzzles, and narrative beats, interfacing with the game would be an entirely different experience, and I definitely have some thoughts on this version of the title, which we'll get to in a little bit. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about the game. The original version of Police Quest, like we just talked about, was part of the collection of Sierra adventure games that utilized the Sierra Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI engine. And with that core engine and technology, you get a style of game that is, in many cases, very similar to one another. And Police Quest, while being a bit more advanced than, say, the original King's Quest, is pretty much a perfect example of an AGI adventure game, in that it utilizes the arrow keys on your keyboard to move your character around the game world, but otherwise all interactions play out based on text parser input. So let's say you want to open up a nearby door. You need to move your character over to that door before you can actually interact with it, as you would expect. Only then, to actually open the door, you need to type the command, open door. After which the game will interpret that command and, assuming it understands what you're instructing it to do, carry out that action. Because of the reliance on text parser commands for interacting with the environment, Police Quest predates the concept of a point-and-click adventure title. And in fact, even if you have a mouse attached to your computer, the game itself won't do anything with it. This is purely a keyboard-driven affair, which comes with some pros and cons. On the pro side, playing a text parser game does provide a form of freedom to your actions that can feel refreshing, in that you're not constrained by a specific set of 5 or 10 or however many commands as you interact with the game world. If you can dream it, you can type it into the game, and occasionally special interactions may arise from inputting a command that isn't what you'd consider standard. So there's definitely the potential for additional freedom playing a text parser title. At the same time, a major potential con for any text parser-based game is the fact that the computer is not smart enough to recognize every potential input and command you may throw at it, which means that you may, on occasion, have to guess to figure out what the game's designers expected you to do in a given scene, or at a minimum, what the game's designers accepted as a valid input. By the time Police Quest came out, the text parser interface was fairly well understood, and developers were getting pretty clever about using synonyms for various commands in an attempt to avoid gamers becoming frustrated with their games, not understanding what they were trying to do. And yes, it is true that Police Quest's parser is certainly better than Sierra's earlier efforts. But I do have some thoughts about the game's parser, which I'll share with everyone in just a little bit. Anyway, beyond the traditional adventure game staples like moving around and interacting with your environment, Police Quest also implements a rudimentary inventory system, very similar to what you'd see in other AGI adventures. Only here, you actually have a way of examining individual items in your inventory to both learn more about specific items, as well as, in some cases, see a small image of the item itself. Compared to an earlier title like King's Quest, this was a major step forward, and even though the inventory itself was a simple text list of items, the fact that you could examine those items and see a graphical representation of the item in question gets us closer to the eventual graphical inventory that would become pervasive across adventure titles in later years. I found it interesting that Police Quest was experimenting with this kind of setup before the truly graphical inventory began to be used, which I thought was a nice touch. One of the other core staples of adventure games is, of course, dialogue with other characters, and here, Police Quest actually features a fair number of characters to interact with and dialogue to experience. In this instance, dialogue is pretty straightforward, in that this game predates the concept of a dialogue tree, meaning that each character will simply talk at you as opposed to you having to choose from several different options to continue a conversation. That being said, there were several interactions that required you to respond to an individual, which you could do by typing your response into the text parser, which would then cause something to happen in that dialogue chain. This was not terribly advanced, and certainly didn't contain the nuance of a bunch of dialogue options for you to select between, as you would see in later games and their dialogue tree interfaces, but I still appreciated the fact that there were a number of characters and interactions that served to liven up the game world a bit. Beyond the kinds of things that pretty much all adventure games implement, Police Quest actually added a number of unique features that serve to make the game a distinct experience from the traditional adventure games prevalent at the time. And of those unique features, one of the most interesting is, by far, the driving interface. We'll go more into the overall story and setup for the game in a little bit, but to provide a bit of a high-level overview, in Police Quest, you play the role of a police officer who, at least at the start of the game, begins life as a patrolman. And one of your first orders of business is to get in your car and patrol the streets of the fictionalized city of Lytton, California. This involves the use of your car, and in many other adventure games, using your car might pop a map up on the screen where you could select from a number of predetermined locations, after which the game would automatically whisk you away to whatever location you ended up choosing. In Police Quest, the act of patrolling and navigating from one location to the next is a much more interactive experience, as you'll actually take control of your car and navigate the city of Lytton via an overhead map, where you can see various locations and landmarks along with other cars driving around, and perhaps most importantly, a fully functioning traffic light system that alternates between red, yellow, and green traffic signals. This interface and the act of navigating the game world in your car is both incredibly innovative, as well as a bit frustrating. One key piece of information that you need to know, and one that plays into the rest of the game, is that Police Quest takes proper police procedure very seriously, and the game has no issue with sending you to an instant game over screen if you fail to properly adhere to police procedure. This might be something as tedious as taking a shower before changing your clothes, to walking around your vehicle before you get in it and drive away, to making sure you put your gun in a nearby locker before entering the local county lockup. We'll talk more about the procedural aspect of the game in a couple minutes, but for now, the area I want to focus on is how real-world police procedure impacts your ability to drive around the city. As you might expect given typical traffic laws, in Police Quest, you can only drive when a traffic light is green. If a light's red, that's considered a moving violation, and in the world of Police Quest, a single infraction is enough for a game over. Okay, easy enough to understand. But, interestingly enough, you have the ability to alter the speed of your vehicle, including putting your sirens on, in which case, you can run a red light without any sort of issue. Now obviously, you don't want this to be your main mode of transportation for a couple reasons. For one, driving to meet up with your fellow officers at a nearby coffee shop with your sirens blaring is pretty unnecessary. But secondly, the act of driving your car at higher speeds is pretty darn challenging. And as with everything else in the game, the driving mechanics are fairly relentless. Meaning, if you nick a fellow car on the road, your car explodes in a violent ball of flame, and you get a game over. Take a turn a little too tight and nudge the curb, kaboom! Game over. Try to pull onto the freeway and miss the entrance ramp by a pixel? Say goodbye, it's game over. Fail to realize that one of the computer-controlled cars is about to make a turn into you at an intersection? Tough luck. Game over. So yeah, the driving mechanics are rife with potential deaths, and the way I combated this situation when I played the game was to literally save the game every time I entered the driving interface, because a singular mistake could legitimately result in your death. As I played the game more and more, I did get fairly accustomed to the driving controls, so much so that the number of deaths I experienced were dramatically reduced later in my playthrough. But I will say that the driving interface, while an awesome addition conceptually, is a bit more cumbersome than I would have preferred. I still love the concept, and a fully realized open-world police procedural title with modern graphics and controls, like a police-centric Grand Theft Auto clone, would be simply amazing. But this original implementation in Police Quest, while a cool idea, was something that was likely hampered by the technology of the time, making it interesting, but also at times frustrating. Beyond the driving rules, like I mentioned earlier, one of Police Quest's biggest claims to fame is the fact that the game is heavily focused on adhering to proper police procedure, and in fact, most of the game over situations in the game occur because you fail to follow that procedure. The good news is the game's manual actually does a pretty good job of outlining the different procedures and steps you need to use throughout your playthrough, assuming you actually read the manual. But for those of you who might not read or have the manual, there will likely be a number of situations that pop up where you'll die or get a game over and assume the game's being unfair. I've got to be honest, I never felt this way at all as I played the game, as the procedural element to the gameplay is something that I've always loved, and even with my latest playthrough, I still loved having to follow police procedure in order to be successful. I will say some of the more tedious items probably could have been eliminated, or at a minimum, reduced in frequency. But at the end of the day, the game really did make you feel like you were learning more about how to be a cop, and the kinds of things you would need to do as part of that job. While I can't personally speak to how close to reality those in-game procedures were, I've got to believe they were mostly based on real-world procedure, given Jim Wall's career as a California highway patrolman, which is kinda cool to consider. Anyway, assuming you follow police procedure and don't get yourself killed, you'll eventually make your way through a game filled with a fairly deep for the time story, coupled with a number of different environments to explore, people to speak with, and puzzles to solve. We'll talk more about my specific thoughts around the rest of the game in just a couple minutes. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box. Because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at, where we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have gameplay videos we could look up on YouTube. When we made a buying decision, that buying decision was based on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from family and friends, and what the box actually looked like in the game store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Police Quest, for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, experience what it's really like to be a cop. Forget the mindless garbage you've seen on television. A police officer's job consists of more than high-speed chases and Dirty Harry shootouts. Drug traffic, homicide, and violence provide the backdrop for their everyday existence. It's a grueling, thankless career of unending responsibility and unexpected jeopardy. Now, to salute those blue knights who serve and protect, Sierra introduces Police Quest, an adventure game that lets you experience what it's like to be a real police officer. Police Quest takes place in Lytton, a small town with a growing problem. A major criminal, dubbed by the press as Death Angel, is creating havoc in the community. Drug trafficking, robbery, and murder have made the streets unsafe, and the crime wave is escalating. In Police Quest, you take on the role of a street cop in uniform. You'll deal with the routine of police life, handing out tickets, attending briefings, and even discovering your best efforts tangled in the red tape of the judicial system. If you make a good cop, you may be asked to go undercover in an assignment to infiltrate the Death Angel's gang and bring the racketeer to justice. Throughout the game, you must follow standard police procedures. You can't shoot first and ask questions later. unless you want an early retirement. One careless mistake, and you could make an arrest that won't hold up in court, or you might let a dangerous suspect get the upper hand. Police Quest is a Sierra 3D animated adventure. It is a game, but with its unflinching situations and real-life dramas, it isn't fantasy. Features over 100 city streets and 4 highways provide the landscape for hot leads and high-speed pursuits. A realistic crime computer provides access to vital information on suspects. An authentic map of Lytton helps you keep track of where you are and where you need to get to. Incredible 3D graphics. Move behind, in front of, and around objects. Full sentence input and optional joystick control. Pop-up text windows for easier reading. And multiple solutions and variable scoring. Play Police Quest over and over again and try to top your previous performance. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show different situations in the game, and there is also a photograph of Jim Walls with a little blurb next to it, which says, "A gripping story. Police Quest is a factual account as told by ex-police officer Jim Walls." With 15 years on the police force, Jim Walls has brought to life the essence of what it is like to be a cop, from stopovers at the local coffee shop to shootouts in Central Park. So that is the back of the box for Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel, and I have got to say, this one sells me 150%. Like I mentioned, I never played the original Police Quest when it was released back on the market. I did get into Police Quest after the VGA remake and then played the entire series, which I absolutely loved. And this box really does it for me. I don't know why. There is something so engaging, gripping, and it might just be me, but there's something that is enthralling about the concept of the whole police procedural thing, having to follow that procedure, having to know what the different radio codes are and all that kind of stuff. It really appeals to me for some reason, and I don't know why. But regardless, the back of the box here absolutely sells me on the game. It looked great. It sounds like an interesting experience, and I really loved the fact that at the end of the whole back of the box write-up, Sierra basically said, or not basically, they did say that this is a game, so it's not real life, but it also isn't fantasy, which was a direct correlation or directly telling you that this is not a King's Quest. This is not a Leisure Suit Larry. This is a mature adult title, and I really did enjoy the back of the box. I love the back of the box. This is one of those boxes that should be on your shelf, at least in my opinion. Anyway, we're going to move on from the box and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Police Quest are pretty much exactly what you would expect from an AGI-era Sierra adventure game, with fairly simple EGA graphics with limited colors and animations, as was prevalent in computer and adventure games around the mid-80s. What I found most striking, though, was just how much personality was able to be captured by these simplistic and limited graphics. Each character, despite only being made up of a handful of pixels, all looked distinct, and were able to convey a degree of emotion on their faces simply by changing a couple pixels. Pixel art, as I've come to realize, is a true art form, and as we've talked about on prior episodes of the podcast, anyone who can work with a limited number of pixels and make meaningful characters out of them deserves a heaping of praise, and certainly the art team on Police Quest is no exception. That quality extended to the game's environments, where even though the total number of colors used in a single scene is relatively small, each location felt like the location it was meant to represent. A police lieutenant's office looked and felt like you would expect a police lieutenant's office to feel and look, complete with the same kinds of office paraphernalia and knickknacks that you would expect based on any number of police procedural movies and television shows. I was seriously impressed with how much diversity and detail was able to be conveyed despite the graphical limitations. And while the graphics certainly don't hold up to VGA-styled graphics from a couple years later, and most certainly don't compare to modern visuals, there is still something special here, and I truly believe the art team did an awesome job with the visuals in the game. I should also mention that the game also contains a fair amount of gore depending on your actions in the game, which was a bit surprising given Sierra's prior titles, most of which stayed away from serious graphical violence. And in fact, I didn't mention this, but on the front of the Police Quest box, there's actually a parental advisory, a totally self-directed parental advisory, because back then there were not rating systems for video games. Sierra actually decided to put a warning on the game itself, which once again lent credence to the fact that this was an adult and mature title. The fact is that Police Quest did not shy away from any violent situations, and if you've ever played the game and gotten yourself into a situation where you get shot, you should expect a shower of bloody pixels to erupt from your body in a display that, honestly, looks incredibly visceral, despite being made up of a ridiculously low number of pixels. Once again, truly awesome work by the art team. Moving on to the sound and music. The sound and music for Police Quest is nothing to write home about, though there are a couple of specific pieces of feedback I feel like I should relay. The first is, it was nice to actually hear music at different stages in the game. As if you'll recall from our King's Quest episode, that title was almost entirely devoid of music and sound. Police Quest does include some very brief snippets of music, which is a nice touch, though the overall quality of the music is nothing like the MIDI and MT32 arrangements that would follow with later Sierra releases. It's still cool that it was included, but the music here is not something that you'll likely think about much after you beat the game. The sound effects, meanwhile, are actually surprisingly detailed, and while there are only a handful of sound effects used throughout the game, they all appear to be digital sound samples of various real-world sounds, which is something I did not expect, but truly appreciate. The bottom line here is that the sound and music was not the star of this particular game. There was nothing here that brought the title down in my eyes, but at the same time, there was nothing here that made me particularly excited either. What was there was simply there, and I have no specific complaints, but also no specific praise to offer. Moving on to the narrative and story, in Police Quest, you take on the role of Sonny Bonds, a patrolman who has made a bit of a name for himself as a top-tier cop capable of more complex cases and assignments in the future. Well, as it turns out, the future is now, as not only do you get involved in a drug trafficking incident early on in your playthrough, but at the same time, a new opportunity opens up in the game's narcotics division. Given your general aptitude and experience, you end up getting the new job, and in that new role, you continue to police the streets in the hopes of bringing the unlawful drug ring to justice. Along the way, you'll have the opportunity to meet interesting and potentially dangerous individuals, explore a fairly expansive for the time virtual city, and hopefully follow the appropriate police procedure to keep you safe and alive to fight another day. So, the story in Police Quest. As always, no major spoilers here, so I can't talk specifically about how the story progresses from the beginning of the game to the end. But what I will say is that for the most part, I really enjoyed the narrative in the game, and the progression from patrolman to narcotics officer was cool to see, especially within the context of the broader story. That being said, things felt just a tad rushed here, and because there was no natural narrative structure that would help to compartmentalize certain events and make the game feel less condensed, the whole thing felt like one run-on series of events. I really feel like the game's story could have been improved by simply including the concept of individual days embedded throughout the playthrough. Even if the story itself was exactly the same, having some sort of breakpoint signifying time passing would have made the whole thing feel a lot more grand in scope, as opposed to a sequence of events that played out one after another without any appreciable appreciation for the amount of time that's passing. I know this probably sounds like a nitpicky kind of thing to focus on, but I'm telling you, the game's story would have felt so much more impactful if it took place over a series of discrete days, as opposed to just one long set of interactions and scenes. Otherwise, I have no complaints about the story itself. It's just the way the story was delivered that I thought could have been made a bit better. I recognize this was an old school adventure game, so I'm not knocking it for not being ahead of the curve from a narrative structure standpoint. I'm simply saying that if looked at from a more modern lens, this one change could have dramatically improved the flow of the story throughout the game. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked about the general structure of the game and its controls, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do have some thoughts on, though, are some very specific aspects of the controls, and then a broader commentary on the use of the text parser in the game. To start, let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific controls used throughout the game, with the first topic of interest being the way you change the speed of your car. When I first started playing, I had a real issue with trying to figure out how to make my car move faster, and in particular, how to turn my sirens on when I witnessed a crime. I assumed that I would need to type a command like turn on sirens in order to enable my flashing lights, only here, the game acted like it didn't know what I was talking about. Only through some internet sleuthing did I discover that the F6, F8, and F10 keys controlled the speed of your car, with the F10 key providing a means to go as fast as possible, as well as enable your sirens. What I didn't realize at the time was that there was a quick reference card provided with the original version of the game that went over all of the different F key combinations that the game might let you use in different situations, which honestly is kinda cool. My issue was, the majority of those F key shortcuts, like taking a shower or getting in and out of your car, could be accomplished using the text parser itself. Why couldn't controlling the speed of your car be handled the same way? I suppose it's possible that I simply didn't figure out the right text parser command to make that happen, but nevertheless, this was a bit of a miss from my perspective. More egregious was trying to figure out how to walk and drive diagonally, which from what I can tell is not referenced anywhere in the game manual, additional documentation, or help menu in the game. As you play the game, there will come certain points where moving diagonally rather than horizontally or vertically would really help, and for most of the game, I didn't even realize there was a way to move diagonally at all. I was able to get by with vertical and horizontal movement for the most part until the very end of the game, where the most difficult enemy of all, a set of diagonal stairs, nearly halted my progress. I could not figure out how to walk up these flights of stairs, and I admit feeling excessively silly being stuck at what should have been a simple obstacle to overcome. Well, it turns out that using your numpad and the diagonal, so to speak, numbers allow you to move in a diagonal direction. Figuring this out was awesome, but also a bit irritating because, like I said, I could not find any formal documentation that suggested this was even a feature. It's possible I might have missed it, or perhaps just the way the games worked back in the 80s from a Sierra adventure game perspective, maybe it was just known to the community and therefore they didn't need to cover it in an instruction manual. But the fact is, it still should have been in the manual, or the instructions, or a reference card, or something. It's possible I missed it, in which case it's totally on me. But if not, then I really do have to question why this wasn't made more explicit for players to utilize, especially for players that may not have played other Sierra adventure games of the time. Anyway, outside of those couple of control snafus, everything else felt fine to control, albeit definitely older school given the AGI interface that the game employed. What we do need to talk a little bit more about, though, is the text parser interface, because it is both an evolution over the parsers that came before it, as well as a frustrating mechanic to utilize to any great degree. First, though, I should mention that the puzzle design in Police Quest is almost entirely logical, which makes perfect sense within the real-world inspired world of the game, and I loved the fact that there weren't any outlandish puzzles prevalent throughout the game. Every puzzle here fit nicely within the context of the game, and there was rarely a situation where I felt stuck because I didn't know what to do. Where I did get stuck, though, was trying to make the parser understand what I wanted it to do, and here, things are more interesting than it might first appear. The thing is, the parser includes a fair number of synonyms for different actions, so much so that for certain portions of the game, I felt like the game was really understanding me, which was an awesome feeling to have. Eventually, however, that illusion would be dispelled, as there was some very specific phrasing needed for certain interactions that I had to scratch my head over. The most frustrating example I have here comes late in the game, where you're on the phone with a taxi service and have to tell them where to go to pick up a passenger. I, thinking I should be as specific as possible, said Hotel Delphoria, which is the exact location I wanted the taxi to go to. Interestingly, when I said that, the taxi dispatch replied with the equivalent of a "where the heck is that?" And at that moment, I felt legitimately confused. How could they not know what I was talking about? This was the exact location that the taxi needed to go to. There was no reason for there to be such a lack of understanding. Well, it turns out that the game was expecting me to simply say the word hotel, at which point the taxi company knows exactly what I'm talking about, and a cab was dispatched post-haste. Now look, I get it. Text parsers, especially in the 80s, were not the most reliable mechanic in a lot of games. But come on, this one there is little excuse for. That being said, there were also certain sequences where the parser was exceedingly logical, which I appreciated. But overall, I felt like most of my frustration with the game came about because of parser issues, as opposed to puzzle issues. This is one of those situations where the technology really let down the rest of the game, and while it wasn't enough to make me feel truly irritated, it was certainly the most frustrating aspect of the entire experience for me. Overall though, and even with the parser inconsistencies, the game itself was surprisingly fun to play, with a well thought out narrative, logical puzzles, and an attention to detail that, while bordering on tedious at times, was still interesting to experience. As long as you know what you're getting into, I truly believe there's a lot to like here, and anyone who has a passing interest in police detective kinds of experiences should definitely check this one out. Just make sure you bring some patience with you, because there is some frustration here. So what is our overall verdict on Police Quest? Well, the original Police Quest has a lot of good stuff going for it, with nicely detailed graphics for the time it was released, an intriguing story, logical puzzles, and an overall framework that exceeds the traditional AGI adventure game from around the same time. That said, there are some aspects of gameplay, most prominently the text parser, that can cause some friction as you play the game. I know it's par for the course given when the game released, but I should be spending my time figuring out the solution to puzzles, not trying to figure out the specific word combination that the developers were expecting in order to progress the game. It'd be one thing if I didn't know what needed to be done in any given situation, but knowing what I needed to do while having the game actively prevent me from performing that action was supremely frustrating. Still, the good does outweigh the bad here, which is why for me, the EGA version of Police Quest is definitely deserving of a spot in our collection of golden oldies. It's not quite a smooth enough experience to make it into the Pantheon, but there's still a ton of things it does well enough that I have no reservations recommending it to other players who may be interested in a well-designed adventure experience. It may not have the chops to make it into our Pantheon, but it is certainly still a good game, which is why Police Quest is undoubtedly deserving of its spot in our list of golden oldies. That was our episode on Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Baldur's Gate, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Baldur's Gate. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.